A few years back, something happened that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I've only decided to share it now because enough time has passed, and I figure there's no real risk in putting it out there. Back then, my wife, Emily, and I had just made the leap from city life to the suburbs. We had 3 kids. Our youngest, baby Sarah, had just been born. Between all the baby gear, toys scattered everywhere, and the general chaos, our cramped apartment felt unbearable. So we found a nice house in a quiet, supposedly safe neighborhood. It was one of those places people described as so peaceful you could leave your doors unlocked. The house wasn't huge, but it felt like a mansion compared to where we'd been. Emily was thrilled with the backyard, which had a slightly overgrown garden filled with old statues. They were worn, almost gothic, and frankly, kind of creepy, like props from a horror movie. Emily loved them, saying they gave the yard character. I couldn't have cared less. I decided to leave the statues as they were, figuring it saved me the hassle of dealing with them. Not long after we moved in, I was looking out the kitchen window one morning when something about the garden caught my eye. One of the statues, an angel with chipped wings, was facing away from the house. That struck me as odd, since I thought all the statues had been facing the house when we moved in. I wasn't entirely sure though, so I let it go. The next morning, while sipping my coffee, I glanced out the window again. My heart skipped a beat. Another statue had turned away from the house. This time, I knew for certain something was off. I casually mentioned it to Emily, but she just shrugged and said I was probably imagining things. I wondered if it might have been our oldest son, Jason. He was always up to something, the little troublemaker. When I asked him about it, though, he just gave me a blank look. Besides, I doubted he could have moved those statues. They were heavy, and he was barely 8 years old. I couldn't shake the feeling that something weird was happening, but I kept it to myself. Life was stressful enough without me adding to the paranoia. Money was tight, and I was constantly on edge about losing my job. The last thing we needed was me losing my mind over some old garden decorations. A few days passed without anything strange happening, and I started to relax. But then, one evening, I glanced out the window and froze. Every single statue was now lined up in a row at the very edge of the yard, facing away from the house. It was like something out of a twisted nightmare. I couldn't breathe for a moment. My stomach churned as I stared at the eerie lineup. I felt like they were all watching me, even though their backs were turned. Summoning my nerve, I decided to go outside and investigate. Before stepping out, I peeked around the yard through the window, making sure no one was lurking. It was still daylight, but every instinct told me to stay inside. Against my better judgment, I opened the back door and stepped into the yard. When I tried to lift one of the statues, I realized just how wrong everything was. The statue was impossibly heavy. There was no way anyone could have moved it without serious effort, let alone arranged all of them like that in one night. Emily came outside just then, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked out as I was. She nervously suggested that maybe the neighbors were pulling some kind of elaborate prank. But that didn't make sense. We met the neighbors. They were boring suburbanites, not the type to mess with a family that had young kids. This wasn't a harmless joke. It felt like a threat. We called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The officer suggested putting up security cameras, but we couldn't afford anything like that. They assured us they'd keep an eye on the area, but it felt like a hollow promise. After they left, Emily and I agreed not to tell the kids what was going on. Jason was sharp, though, and I could tell he knew something wasn't right. Despite the police visit, I was still constantly looking out the window, half expecting to see the statues moving on their own. A week passed without incident, and I started convincing myself the nightmare was over. The house finally began to feel like home, at least until that weekend. That morning, I went outside to play with the kids in the backyard. As we stepped outside, my heart dropped. Spray painted in thick, black letters across the back wall of our house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped baby Sarah in shock. My pulse pounded as I scooped up the kids and rushed them inside. Shaking, I told Emily to keep them in the living room while I stormed back out into the yard. I was furious. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I darted through the garden, yelling at the top of my lungs. I wanted to catch whoever had done this, to make them pay. But the yard was empty. No footsteps, no signs of anyone leaving in a hurry. As I trudged back toward the house, my anger was replaced by fear. This was no prank, this was a message. Someone wanted us gone, and they were escalating. We called the police again, but they were just as unhelpful as before. They brushed it off as graffiti, probably from local kids. When I insisted this was something serious, they promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood. That was little comfort. Emily was in tears that night. I did my best to reassure her, though deep down, I knew things were only going to get worse. That evening, I was standing in the kitchen, trying to gather my thoughts, when a blood-curdling scream came from the living room. It was Emily. Emily's scream jolted me from my thoughts, and I sprinted into the living room. She was standing by the window, frozen in place, pointing into the backyard. My heart dropped as I followed her gaze. There were 5 figures standing in the yard. They wore identical white masks that obscured their faces, and their movements were utterly unnatural. They danced in an erratic, jerky way, like broken puppets. It was horrifying, like something from a demented nightmare. For a few moments, Emily and I stood rooted to the spot, too stunned to act. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. Who were they? What did they want? I shook off my paralysis, ran to the kitchen, and grabbed the largest knife I could find. "Call the cops!" I barked at Emily, my voice cracking with panic. While she fumbled for her phone, I charged out the back door, knife in hand, screaming like a man possessed. I hoped my display of aggression would scare them off, but as I took my first step toward them, dread flooded my veins. There were 5 of them. What if they were armed? As quickly as my bravado had appeared, it vanished. I backed away, retreating into the house like a coward. But something about the knife must have worked. They stopped their bizarre dance, glanced at me, and bolted into the darkness of the garden, disappearing from view. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and yelled for Emily to grab the kids and hide upstairs. My hands were trembling as I stood guard at the back door, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. When the police arrived, they searched the yard and surrounding area but found no trace of the masked intruders. One officer tried to reassure us, saying it was probably teenagers pulling a prank. But I wasn't buying it. This was something else, something malicious. The very next day, I swallowed my pride and shelled out the money for a set of security cameras. I spent the entire day installing them, ensuring every inch of our property was covered. Emily was still visibly shaken, barely able to eat or sleep. She begged me to consider moving, but I reminded her how tight our finances were. "Let's see if the cameras deter them," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "If one more thing happens, we'll leave. I promise." Luckily, the cameras seemed to work. We never saw the masked figures again, and for a while, things settled down. Still, the thought of what happened haunted me. We stayed in that house for years, but we never got an explanation for what those people were doing in our yard. To this day, I still feel a chill every time I think about it. Fast forward to now, and my wife, Taylor, and I have recently moved out of that old place. She wasn't happy living so close to her family and wanted to put some distance between us. We don't have kids, and Taylor hasn't worked in years, so relocating was relatively simple. As an electrician, my work is flexible, and I can pick up jobs just about anywhere. We ended up moving to a rural part of New Mexico, a lifestyle we were both comfortable with. The house we bought was bigger than we needed, especially since it was just us and our black lab, Max. But the extra space seemed like a bonus, perfect for hosting friends or family if the opportunity ever arose. For the first few months, everything was fine. But then, little things started happening. The upstairs lights would trip the circuit breaker, though the rest of the house would stay powered. It was an odd issue, but I figured it was an easy fix. One day, I finally decided to take a closer look. I headed down to the basement, where I assumed the breaker panel was. I hadn't spent much time in the basement since we moved in, It was mostly cluttered with old furniture and random junk left by the previous owners. After rummaging around for a bit, I found the panel and quickly identified the problem. It was a simple load imbalance. I made a note to rewire it later and was about to head back upstairs when something in the far corner of the basement caught my eye. Behind a stack of dusty wooden chairs was a large metal door. It wasn't just any door. It was industrial grade, thick, and taller than a standard door. It reminded me of something you'd see in a bank vault or a high-security facility. I walked over, my curiosity piqued. The door was locked, and the handle wouldn't budge. It was the kind of door you'd expect the realtor to mention, yet they hadn't said a word about it. I went upstairs and rummaged through a drawer of spare keys the previous owners had left behind. I tried every single one, 15 in total, but none worked. When I told Taylor about the door, she was just as intrigued as I was. She worked her magic and managed to track down the previous owners. When I asked them about the door, their response made my stomach turn. There was a long pause before the wife spoke. "Oh, that's just a storm shelter. For tornadoes," she said, her voice uneasy. I told her it was locked and asked if they had the key. She hesitated before replying. "We lost it years ago. You should probably just leave it alone." Her tone sent shivers down my spine. She sounded evasive, almost scared. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't telling me the whole story. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with the door. I tried everything I could think of to open it, but the lock was too complex. Finally, I gave in and hired a locksmith. When he arrived, I led him down to the basement and let him get to work. After about half an hour, he called me down. "This isn't your average storm shelter lock," he said, frowning. "It's unusually complex for something like this." It took him another 30 minutes, but he finally managed to crack it. I wish he hadn't. Inside the room, we found what looked like a shrine. The walls were covered in old black and white photographs, each marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a single chair, positioned to face one of the walls. The air was stale and smelled faintly of decay. In one corner was a cot with crumpled blankets. Scattered around were empty chip bags, water bottles, and other trash. Someone had been living in this room recently. As I tried to process what I was seeing, my eyes landed on another door at the far end of the room. It was smaller and partially hidden in the shadows. I opened it and realized it led to a staircase that ended at the cellar door outside. I felt like an idiot. All this time, someone had been living in our house, using the cellar door to come and go as they pleased. Suddenly, all the strange little things we noticed, the missing items, the misplaced objects, clicked into place. It wasn't forgetfulness or coincidence. Someone had been there the entire time. I couldn't wrap my mind around what had happened. I had no idea who had been in there or why, but I was damn sure I didn't want them coming back. I tried calling the previous owners, demanding an explanation, threatening legal action, but they wouldn't pick up. Either they disconnected their number or just didn't care enough to deal with me. Chloe was freaking out, but I wasn't. I wasn't scared, I was pissed. That night, I moved some heavy furniture and barricaded the cellar door from the inside. I found a thick chain and a heavy-duty padlock and shut it up for good measure. I didn't give a damn what it took. There was no way I was letting someone sneak back in through that door. The police came, took a full report, and left, telling us they'd do their best to get in contact with the previous owners. We even called our realtor, who was clearly horrified, and promised to assist the police however she could. But that night, just as we were settling into bed, we heard it. A loud bang on the front door. Lola shot up, barking like a maniac. Chloe and I froze, staring at each other. Neither of us moved. After a few minutes, the banging stopped, but then we heard small rocks tapping against the bedroom window. Chloe was clutching Lola, and I knew what was coming. I went to look out the window, my heart pounding with anger. Chloe begged me not to, but I wasn't about to back down now. In my mind, I was already preparing for a fight. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and ripped the curtains open, but I couldn't see anything. We both stood there, waiting, but nothing happened. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I sprinted downstairs, my fists clenched in fury, just in time to see two figures running away from the house. The kitchen window was completely shattered. I called the police immediately. They showed up soon after, searched the house and the basement, but found no sign of forced entry into the storm room. They didn't find anyone on the property either. Their best guess was that whoever had been living down there got angry when they realized they were locked out, so they decided to come back and scare us. I was furious, and I didn't care who knew it. Chloe was a wreck. The police escalated the situation, labeling it an actual crime, and said they'd be working to track down the previous owners, but it could take a few days. That was 2 full days ago, and we still haven't heard from them. But I think the police scared off those squatters. For now, at least. Haven't heard a thing since. Honestly, I'm shocked that something like this could even happen. If we don't get in touch with the previous owners soon, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm fully prepared to defend myself, but I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. When I bought my first house, I was only 27. I'd saved up for years, and even though it was just a small, modest place, I was proud of it. Moving in, though, that took some getting used to. I had lived with my parents my whole life, with 3 siblings and 2 dogs. The house was always loud, always buzzing with life. But this place? This place was dead quiet. Honestly, it was eerie at first. The lack of noise was the hardest part of the transition. Living alone felt strange. At first, I didn't think I'd ever get used to it. Anyone who's gone from living with family to living alone knows exactly what I'm talking about. One thing I really liked about the house was the tiny balcony on the 2nd floor. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't even call it a real balcony. It was barely big enough for me to stand on, and I couldn't fit a chair out there. But it was mine. I'd go out there most nights after work, just to clear my head. I smoked pretty often, but I hated the smell. Smoking inside was never an option for me. The balcony was a perfect solution for that. No need to leave the comfort of my home to get a smoke. It felt like a luxury. Now, the layout of the property was pretty standard. Houses next to each other all the way down the street, and behind mine, the same thing. Everyone shared a backyard if not for the 10-foot-tall fences marking the property lines. From my balcony, I could see into my backyard neighbor's yard. After a few weeks, I realized I had met almost every neighbor, except him. In fact, I don't think I had ever seen him, let alone spoken to him. The guy never waved, never came over. I never saw him in the yard, never saw his bedroom window open. It was like he didn't exist. If not for the occasional bedroom light flicking on at night, I would have assumed the place was abandoned. The grass was overgrown and hadn't been cut in years. I never heard any sounds from his yard. After another week, my curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to go introduce myself. At least I'd know who I was living next to. One Saturday, I walked around the block to his place, expecting to knock on the door and maybe have a quick conversation. But the house looked worse than I expected. Rough was an understatement. It looked untouched. The yard was a jungle of weeds, the paint was peeling, and some of the siding had been scratched off. The walkway was stained and dirty. The doorbell was broken, so I knocked a few times, hoping someone would answer. But nothing. I stood there awkwardly, wondering if maybe the house was truly vacant. But then I saw it, a slight flicker behind the window's shade. Someone was watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I wasn't going to be intimidated. I was about to leave when, without warning, the door flew open, slamming hard against the wall like it was torn open in a fit of rage. I jumped back, thrown off balance. There, standing in the doorway, was an elderly woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She was small, frail-looking, but her skin was tight, like she was holding herself in a permanent, unnatural tension. Her eyes were wide, unsettlingly wide. I could feel a knot form in my stomach just looking at her. There was something off about her. She didn't say a word, just stared at me, expressionless. Finally, I cleared my throat and introduced myself as her new neighbor. After a few seconds, she said her name was Priscilla, but only gave me a half smile before going back to her unsettling stare. That was it. She didn't even ask for my name. It was one of the strangest interactions I'd ever had. I nodded, turned around, and walked away, my skin crawling. I never heard the door close behind me, but I didn't want to turn around and risk getting caught looking. That night, I went out to the balcony like usual, trying to forget about the weird encounter. But when I looked over the railing, there she was, standing dead center in her yard, staring straight up at my house. She didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there staring. It was one of those moments where you question your own perception. I didn't know if I should wave, ignore her, or call the cops. It was one of the creepiest things I'd ever seen, and I couldn't handle it. I went back inside, trying to shake it off. I told myself she was just some old woman with a few screws loose. But the next night, I saw her again. This time, she was moving from one window to another inside her house, peeking through each one, watching me. She knew I knew she was watching me. I pretended not to notice, but she didn't stop. She kept watching me, even after I finished my smoke and went inside. About 20 minutes later, I peeked out the window to see if she was still there. To my horror, she was. I called my dad and told him about it. He insisted she probably had dementia or was just lonely and confused. He said I should feel bad for her. Honestly, it was hard to feel sympathy for someone who was practically stalking me. But I listened to him. For a few nights, things went back to normal. I didn't see her in her yard, and I started to relax, feeling like maybe my dad was right, that I shouldn't make a big deal out of it. But then one morning, I found a woman's sock sitting in my yard, right on my side of the fence. My stomach dropped. That was no coincidence. She had been on my property. I didn't know what to do. I should have called the police right there, but I didn't want to cause a scene with a neighbor, especially with someone as strange as her. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the doorbell ring. Not once, not twice, but at least a dozen times, one after another. I didn't need to look. I knew exactly who it was. My mind was racing, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't scared, just frustrated. I grabbed a shirt and threw it on, pacing to the door. In my mind, I kept repeating that I just needed to make her leave me alone. I told myself I'd been putting this off for too long, and it was time to deal with it. Looking back now, I can't even believe how flippantly I handled the whole situation. I can't say I was naive, but I sure wasn't taking it as seriously as I should have. I honestly don't even know why I wasn't scared, considering everything that had happened up until then. But there I was, thinking I could just talk her down, like it was just some annoying neighbor issue. The second I opened the door, everything changed. She lunged at me, full speed, with a kitchen knife in her hand, her face twisted in pure rage. She started screaming at me about how I'd taken her son from her. I barely had time to register what was going on. In one swift move, I grabbed her arm and wrestled the knife away. My heart was pounding in my chest as I forced her to the floor, pinning her down. She wasn't strong, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. My hands were shaking, my adrenaline was through the roof, and I was just trying to keep it together long enough to get help. She didn't stop screaming. She kept yelling about her son, her words barely making sense, and promised that she was going to kill me. At one point, she even tried to bite me, her teeth snapping at my arm. But I wasn't letting her go. Not for a second. Not until the police arrived. It felt like the longest 5 minutes of my life. She didn't stop wriggling, screaming, fighting me the entire time. My hands were slick with sweat, my mind racing. I kept thinking, this can't be real. This can't be happening. But it was. When the police finally showed up, they moved fast. They restrained her, practically throwing her into the back of one of their cruisers. She was still screaming at the top of her lungs as they shoved her into the car, and I could hear her screams echoing even after they drove away. I had never been more terrified in my life. The officers made sure I was okay, telling me she'd be sent to some kind of psychiatric facility. but I never saw her again after that. The whole thing still weighs heavily on me. It's made me paranoid, on edge. I moved out not long after. I just couldn't stay there. The whole situation made me feel like I couldn't trust anyone, not even my own neighbors.